Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
This Christmas, I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't bake sugar cookies. I didn't even untangle the lights from the garage shelf like I usually do while humming along to some outdated playlist. My mother swears is just more festive than mine. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a lukewarm mug of coffee while my phone buzzed silently across from me, its screen lighting up with a new message from my sister, Rachel. One line. "Let's talk when you're less emotional, okay?" I didn't reply. I didn't need to. It started 2 weeks before Christmas, on a Wednesday afternoon that already felt off. The kind of afternoon where the air's too quiet and your gut's telling you something's about to shift. I was still at work, finishing up reports, when I got a call from my mom. She started the conversation with her usual overly sweet tone. That voice she uses when she's either hiding something or trying to sell you an idea you didn't ask for. She said she'd been thinking, and this year, maybe it would be less stressful for everyone if I skipped Christmas. She was careful to add that it was nothing personal, which of course meant it was entirely personal. I didn't say anything at first, just let the words hang there like smoke. She filled the silence by mentioning how chaotic things have been with Rachel's boys, and that space might help, and how she just wanted to keep the peace. The more she spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't her idea. This was Rachel's play. I could hear it in the forced softness of her voice, the way she rushed through the explanation like she was embarrassed by it, but not enough to stop. It wasn't the first time. Rachel had always known how to wrap our parents around her pinky finger. 6 years younger than me, always with some crisis or achievement that demanded attention. As kids, I cleaned up her messes and got scolded when I didn't do it fast enough. As adults, it just got sneakier. She didn't need to throw tantrums anymore. She just made a few calls, dropped a few hints, and suddenly I was too difficult, too opinionated, or in this case, too much for Christmas this year. And you know what I did? I agreed. I said, "Okay, Mom, if that's what everyone wants, I'll stay home." She paused, confused, maybe even disappointed that I didn't put up a fight. That's the thing about people like her. They expect you to resist so they can feel justified in pushing you out, but I didn't resist. I just smiled to myself, hung up the phone, and spent the rest of the evening doing something I hadn't done in a long time, thinking about what I wanted. Here's where it gets interesting. You ever had a moment where someone crosses a line, and instead of getting angry, you just shut the door? Quietly, permanently. No screaming, no drama, just a calm, cold clarity that tells you this part is done now? That was me, sitting on my couch that night, realizing I wasn't hurt anymore, just done. That's when I remembered the cabin. Now, before you assume anything, this cabin wasn't some rusty old shack in the woods. It was our family's prized possession, a modest but beautiful lakeside cabin in Vermont, passed down from my grandfather, full of old quilts, uneven floorboards, and memories sewn into every corner. Officially, it was jointly owned by me and Rachel, willed to us after our father's minor heart scare 10 years ago. But in reality, it was mine in every way that counted. I was the one who paid for the new roof, the plumbing fixes, the snow removal, the taxes when Rachel forgot for 3 years in a row. I was the one who drove up there in the dead of winter to seal the windows and stack the firewood. Rachel just showed up in the summer with her kids, snapped photos for Instagram, and left crumbs and chaos behind. The idea came slowly at first, just a whisper in the back of my mind. But within a day, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I pulled out the paperwork, found my half of the deed, and made a phone call to someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. Jack. Jack wasn't a boyfriend, not exactly. He was a friend from college who helped me renovate the cabin years ago when I first inherited it, and it was basically a raccoon motel. He loved that place as much as I did, maybe more. Quiet, practical, a bit of a hermit, but loyal in that quiet way some men are, where they show up without asking and fix things without being told. We'd kept in touch loosely, and when I told him I wanted to transfer my share of the cabin to him, no money, no questions. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You sure?" And when I said yes, he didn't argue. He just said, "All right, I'll handle the papers." 3 days later, it was done. And then I waited. Because here's the part no one tells you about revenge. It's not about making a scene. It's about choosing not to play anymore and letting the silence do the work. It's about watching people panic when the thing they thought they owned, controlled, or took for granted suddenly slips out from under them. Rachel didn't call until a week later. She left a voicemail pretending everything was normal, asking about Christmas logistics like I was still expected. I didn't respond. A few days after that, she texted me a question about the cabin key code. "I think it reset. Kids are excited. Can you remind me what it is?" I told her, "I'm not the person to ask anymore." 10 minutes later, my phone rang. And when I didn't pick up, she left a voicemail that started cheerful and ended with a very confused, very annoyed, "What do you mean you're not the person to ask?" She still didn't get it. That's when I knew it was really going to hit them, harder than any argument ever could. So here's my question to you watching this. Have you ever been slowly pushed out of your own family without a single word being said? What would you do if the people who claim to love you most made it clear you were optional? Would you fight to stay? Or would you walk away and take something they never imagined you'd give up? Because I didn't slam the door. I just quietly locked it behind me. And now they're realizing they don't have a key. Some people look at a cabin in the woods and see just that. A structure made of wood and nails, with drafty corners, a squeaky screen door, and maybe a nostalgic scent of pine and mildew tucked into the walls. But that little place on Lake Elmore had never been just a weekend getaway or a summertime photo op. For me, it was something far more personal and painful. It was history, debt, leverage, memory, and the last tangible thing that still tied me to a version of my family that once felt real. When I gave it away, I didn't just transfer a property. I shifted the balance of power in a way none of them saw coming, especially not Rachel, who had built her little kingdom on top of that cabin without lifting a finger to keep it standing. I was 10 the first time I visited that place. My grandfather was still alive then, a tall, broad-shouldered man who smelled like pipe smoke and cinnamon gum, who would lean against the porch railing in his thick wool sweater and talk to me like I wasn't a child, which was rare in our family. He'd built most of the cabin himself back in the 60s, with help from his brothers and a few fishing buddies, and he treated it with the kind of reverence most people save for church. He called it our place of quiet, and he meant it. There was no TV, no clocks in the main room, no distractions except for the water, the wind, and the weight of your own thoughts. Back then, it was magic. When he died, and the property passed into my parents' hands, things began to shift. Rachel was still in high school then, full of drama and stories and constant emergencies. I was already working full-time, living in a one-bedroom apartment, struggling with bills and loneliness and the exhausting weight of being the responsible one. Mom started using the cabin as Rachel's reward. "Take your sister up there for a weekend, she's been stressed." Or, "Rachel wants to bring her friends for graduation. Don't be difficult." Or my favorite, "You don't even use it much. What's the big deal?" The guilt was quiet but consistent, a background noise I eventually stopped questioning. When Dad had his first heart scare, they updated the will. The cabin was split between me and Rachel. 50-50, no strings, equal ownership. Except, of course, it never really was. Because equal ownership means equal effort, equal money, equal responsibility. And Rachel didn't do equal anything. She showed up when the sun was out, when the fridge was full, when the beds were made and the firewood already stacked. She called dibs on weekends without asking, left dishes in the sink, and every year, like clockwork, forgot to send her half of the property tax check until I'd already paid it. When I brought it up, she'd laugh and say I was so intense about it, like I was the unreasonable one for expecting a grown woman to carry her own weight. It wasn't about the money, though, not really. It was about being erased, slowly, year by year, until all that remained of me in that cabin were a few framed photos from childhood and a shelf of books no one touched, until the narrative became Rachel's cabin, or Where Rachel Takes the Kids. And I became a ghost that handled the logistics from a distance, like some personal concierge no one tipped or thanked. The summer before this Christmas fiasco, I'd driven up to the cabin alone, uninvited, unannounced. Rachel had left it unlocked, the place a mess. Toys scattered across the floor, peanut butter smeared on the kitchen counter, trash bags half full and reeking. I cleaned it up silently, the way I always had, and that night I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, listening to the trees and wondering what it would take to finally let go of this place. That was when the idea first brushed against my mind, soft and dangerous. I didn't act on it then, but the seed was planted. Sometimes all you need is time and one final insult to let it grow. That insult came wrapped in holiday cheer and fake smiles. The phone call about skipping Christmas wasn't a surprise. It was just confirmation. Proof that the role I'd played in this family, stable, invisible, endlessly accommodating, was no longer useful to them. And if I was no longer needed, then neither was my silence. You know what really solidified my decision? A conversation I overheard 2 years ago at Thanksgiving. Rachel talking to our cousin Mark, laughing about how Sarah treats the cabin like her shrine or something. Like, okay, we get it, you read books and drink red wine and have your little solitude moments, but this is a family space. She said it like it was a joke, but the kind that draws blood. That's when I realized Rachel didn't just think she deserved more. She genuinely believed I had less to offer, less value, less love, less need for space, for rest, for recognition. So when I handed that cabin over to Jack, it wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about self-preservation, about finally stepping out of the role they shoved me into and choosing not to explain myself anymore. Jack was stunned, of course. He'd been half in love with that place for years, and probably a little in love with me too, though we never talked about it. When I told him it was his now, no catch, no warning, he asked once, just once, if I was absolutely sure. And I said yes because I was. More than I'd ever been about anything. The paperwork was easy, clean, no drama. I signed the transfer and sent it through, done, gone, no breadcrumbs, no forwarding address. I thought it would feel like loss, like grief. Instead, it felt like I'd exhaled for the first time in years. Funny, isn't it? The place that held all my guilt, my loyalty, my quiet sacrifices. It was never just a cabin. It was the one thing they couldn't take from me, because they'd never truly understood what it meant. And when I let it go, I didn't lose anything. They did. They just didn't know it yet. But they would. And when they did, it would be loud, messy, and completely, utterly out of their control. The most delicious part of a plan executed in silence is that when the shockwave finally hits, it echoes louder than any scream ever could. It doesn't beg for attention or demand sympathy. It just unfolds, calm and clean, like a guillotine sliding quietly through air before the impact. When I finalized the paperwork and signed my half of the cabin over to Jack, I didn't do it out of vengeance, not initially anyway. It was a gesture of finality, a quiet erasure of obligation, an ending I orchestrated with the kind of grace I never received from them. And once the ink dried and the deed was sealed, I closed my laptop, exhaled, and let the silence do what it does best. Wait patiently for the chaos to come looking for me. It was 6 days before Christmas when the first ripple came. Innocent in tone, but laced with something sharp just beneath the surface. Rachel sent me a cheerful text, one of those artificial, overly bright messages she uses when she's trying to pull off manipulation without making it obvious. Hey, hope you're having a relaxing week. Just heading up to the cabin with the kids. Can't get the key code to work. Did you change it or something? I read it twice, chuckled without humor, and let it sit unanswered for a few hours. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. I'm not the person to ask anymore. I didn't elaborate. I didn't add a smiley face or a wink or a passive-aggressive jab. I gave her just enough to fuel her confusion, just enough to push her into the next phase of realization, that something was no longer in her control. The next morning, I woke up to 5 missed calls, 2 from Rachel, 1 from Mom, 1 from Dad, which shocked me most. He rarely calls unless something breaks or someone dies, and 1 from an unknown number, which I suspected, correctly it turns out, was Jack. His voicemail was short, dry as always. So they've noticed. Apparently Rachel had driven all the way up to the cabin, kids in tow, gifts in the trunk, fully expecting the place to welcome her like it always had. But when the keypad didn't work, and her spare key wasn't where she usually left it taped under the deck post, yes, taped, like an amateur burglar wouldn't find it in seconds, she panicked. Not outright, not in front of her kids, but enough to call me at 8 in the evening, then again at 10, and again at midnight. I ignored each one, not out of spite, but because, for once, she needed to sit in the mess without someone cleaning it up behind her. By the next day, the messages changed tone. Less cheerful, more curt, accusatory. "Did you sell the cabin?" Followed by, "I brought the kids up here for the holiday. What the hell is going on?" And finally, "This isn't funny, Sarah. This is family." That last one almost made me laugh. Family, the same word they used when they asked me to step aside for the holidays. The same word they hid behind whenever they wanted something from me but didn't want to be held accountable for how they took it. When Mom called, she tried a different approach, softer, measured, like she was back in her guidance counselor voice. She told me Rachel was very upset, and that the boys were crying because they couldn't go inside and put up their stockings. I listened silent as she described how confused they all were, how they didn't understand why I would change the locks or make this kind of decision without talking to anyone first. I waited until she finished, until the guilt had been laid out with surgical precision, and then I answered her with the kind of clarity that comes from years of swallowing disappointment. "I didn't change the locks. I no longer own the cabin. I gave it away. It's not mine anymore." The pause on the other end of the line was so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said slowly, "You gave it away?" Like the words didn't make sense in her mouth, as if they belonged to a language she'd never bothered to learn. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone flat, deliberate. "I transferred my share to someone else. No warning, no drama, just done." She started to protest, but I cut her off, something I almost never did, and told her that I had no legal obligation to consult Rachel or her or anyone else, and that the person who now co-owns the cabin isn't someone who answers to her phone calls or Rachel's guilt trips. Then I hung up, not out of anger, but because, truly, there was nothing else to say. A few hours later, Jack called again, this time with more detail. Rachel had tried to get into the cabin. She brought her husband, who tried to reason with Jack, waving a copy of an old family photo like it was proof of ownership. Jack, ever patient, told him to leave. When they refused, he called the local sheriff, not to have them arrested, just to make a point that the old games, the old rules, the old hierarchy, they no longer applied here. Rachel left that night, furious and humiliated, driving 3 hours back home with 2 screaming kids and an empty gas tank. And I made dinner, I played a Miles Davis record, I took a bath, I didn't celebrate, I didn't gloat, I just existed peacefully, which honestly was the sharpest form of revenge I could offer. Because the people who spend their lives controlling everything around them, they don't know what to do when you simply remove yourself from their reach. What they don't know yet, but will soon figure out, is that Jack has no intention of selling the cabin, not now, not ever. He's already started renovating it, putting in a wood-burning stove, fixing the upstairs railing, repainting the trim I never had time to get to. And Rachel, she's locked out, literally and metaphorically, from the one place she never thought she'd be excluded from. She can call it petty. She can call it betrayal. But the truth is, it was a long overdue correction. A balancing of scales that had been tipped against me since the day she learned how to cry her way out of trouble and into favor. And if she wants back in, if she wants access again, she's going to have to do something she's never done in her life, earn it. And something tells me that might just be beyond her. There's a particular moment, almost imperceptible but unmistakable once it arrives, when someone who has always underestimated you suddenly realizes they no longer have the upper hand. That split-second silence between words where confusion bleeds into fear, not because you've raised your voice or made a threat, but because without any fanfare, you've simply stopped playing the part they assigned you. That moment came for my family 3 days before Christmas, and the ripple it created was something I could practically feel in the air, like a shift in pressure before a storm breaks open the sky. Rachel called again, this time not with her forced cheeriness or her condescending just checking in tone, but with the brittle edge of someone who's realizing that for once, her tactics won't work. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. Her voice was tight, clipped halfway between anger and disbelief, the way people sound when they're so used to getting their way that anything less than immediate compliance feels like a personal attack. She asked if I had lost my mind, told me that what I'd done was illegal and insane, and that I needed to undo whatever stunt I thought I was pulling. I let her speak. I listened to every word, every false accusation, every desperate plea dressed up as righteous indignation, and when she finally stopped to breathe, I responded in the calmest, most dispassionate tone I could manage. It's done. It's legal, and you're not entitled to anything you didn't contribute to. She didn't like that. Not one bit. I could hear it in the silence that followed, in the way her breath caught, in the little gasp that came just before she slammed the call shut without another word. She expected me to backpedal, to apologize, to soften the blow with some variation of, I just needed space, or we can fix this, because that's what I've always done, make peace, smooth things over, be the one who absorbs the impact so no one else has to feel uncomfortable. But not this time, not anymore. When Mom called later that night, she didn't come in guns blazing like Rachel. She tried to lean on the nostalgia, to weaponize sentimentality in the way only mothers know how. She asked me if I remembered the Christmas in 2008 when I came down with the flu and Rachel stayed up all night making tea for me, which of course never happened. But Mom's memory has always been suspiciously selective when it suits her. She reminded me that the cabin was where we scattered my grandfather's ashes, that it's not just a house, it's a legacy, and that my actions were tearing apart something sacred. I almost admired the performance. The careful layering of guilt and moral duty, the invocation of our family name like it still held some kind of weight, some kind of unifying power that could override the years of imbalance and quiet mistreatment I had swallowed in silence. But when she said, "You're punishing everyone just because you feel left out," something inside me snapped, not in a violent or explosive way, but in that final, irreversible way a rope finally breaks after being pulled too tightly for too long. "No," I said slowly, carefully, making sure every word landed exactly where I needed it to. "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just no longer volunteering for disrespect." That ended the conversation. The next morning, my father sent a text. Short, stiff, as always. "I wish you'd talk to me first." The irony nearly made me laugh. The man who had never once stepped in to stop the favoritism, who sat silent at every family dinner while my accomplishments were dismissed and Rachel's minor wins were celebrated like Nobel Prizes, was now expressing disappointment because I hadn't consulted him about a decision that affected only me. But I didn't reply, because there was nothing left to say, nothing worth salvaging in a relationship built entirely on polite distance and quiet neglect. The fallout began in earnest when Jack called to tell me Rachel had tried to show up again, this time with her husband Stephen in tow, probably hoping a man would intimidate Jack into submission. Jack, God bless him, simply stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee, looked Stephen dead in the eye and said, "Unless you've got a court order or a deed with your name on it, you're trespassing." Rachel apparently screamed something about lawyers and family betrayal, while Stephen stood there with his arms crossed like he was still deciding whether to play tough guy or concerned husband. Jack didn't flinch, just sipped his coffee, told them they had 5 minutes to leave before he called the sheriff, and went back inside. They left, not gracefully, not with dignity, but with the kind of reluctant rage that comes from knowing you've been outmaneuvered and there's nothing you can do about it. After that, the messages stopped. No more calls, no more guilt trips, just silence, which, oddly enough, was the loudest response of all because it meant they were regrouping, figuring out their next move, trying to decide whether to fight or to freeze me out permanently. I didn't care. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a response or a reaction or a seat at their table. I'd built my own. Christmas came and went quietly. I spent it with a friend, someone who knew how to sit in comfortable silence without making me feel like I needed to perform gratitude or hide exhaustion. We drank wine, cooked too much food, and watched old black and white movies while the snow piled up outside like a clean white curtain cutting off the rest of the world. There were no matching pajamas, no staged family photos, no passive-aggressive comments over dinner. Just peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't come wrapped in obligation or soaked in nostalgia. I checked my phone only once that day, just to make sure no emergencies had popped up, and I saw that the family group chat, still titled Team Christmas from 2 years ago, had over 20 unread messages. I didn't open them. Whatever chaos had unfolded, whatever complaints or explanations or thinly veiled insults were being exchanged in that digital echo chamber, they weren't for me. Not anymore. Because they never thought I'd actually walk away. They never thought the one who always kept the peace, who always caved, who always showed up with a bottle of wine and a strained smile, would one day put the bottle down, wipe that smile off her face, and choose herself. But I did. And now they were left staring at a locked cabin door that used to open automatically, wondering what the hell happened. I'll tell you what happened. I stopped asking for permission. I stopped waiting for the right time. I stopped mistaking tolerance for love. And I started acting like someone who finally understood the difference between being included and being respected. And trust me, once you feel the difference, there's no going back. There comes a point in every long overdue reckoning when silence stops being a consequence and becomes a boundary, a wall that no longer invites climbing, a space that no longer echoes with the footsteps of people who once walked freely through your life, as if their presence was some immutable law of the universe. And as I stood at the window on Christmas morning, watching the frost climb lazily up the edges of the glass, while the early sun stretched itself across the quiet street outside, I realized that this was the first holiday in decades where I didn't feel the gnawing pressure of expectation pressing down on my chest, didn't feel the dread disguised as tradition, didn't feel like I was walking into a performance dressed up as a family gathering. Instead, I felt calm, rooted, maybe even a little empty, but not in a bad way, more like the kind of emptiness that comes after cleaning out a cluttered room when you finally have space to breathe and everything echoes a little until you get used to it. I spent the day with Clara, an old friend from college who, like me, had grown tired of the performative joy and passive-aggressive obligation that seemed to swirl around the holidays like too sweet eggnog. We cooked a ridiculous amount of food for 2 people, drank wine that was far too expensive for the occasion, but tasted exactly right, and let the hours pass without any structured conversation or need to entertain one another. At one point, she asked me if I missed it, meaning the family, the cabin, the rituals we're taught to worship even when they no longer serve us. And I answered honestly, without the bitterness I once carried. I miss what I thought it could be, but not what it was. Meanwhile, the other side of this story, the one still clinging to the illusion that family means ownership and history means entitlement, was unraveling, and not slowly. According to Jack, who called me that evening with the kind of detached amusement only a man like him could deliver without sounding smug, Rachel had spent most of the day trying to reach a lawyer she'd found online, someone who apparently advertised quick resolutions for family property disputes, and who by lunchtime had already told her in clear, legally unimpressed terms that unless she could prove fraud or coercion, which, of course, she couldn't, there was nothing to be done. The transfer was clean, notarized, fully compliant with state law, and most damning of all, It had been sitting in the county records office for over a week. She'd never noticed, because she never thought she had to. That's the thing about people like Rachel. They're so used to getting what they want with nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a well-timed sigh that they don't know what to do in the system they relied on. Favoritism, manipulation, family inertia suddenly stops spinning on their behalf. They mistake access for ownership, affection for control, and presence for power. And when that illusion breaks, they flail, desperate to reclaim something they never truly valued until it was gone. And my parents? They didn't show up to defend her this time. Not publicly, not to Jack, not even in the group chat, which by now had devolved into a string of cryptic messages, guilt-laced holiday greetings, and one particularly vague quote Mom posted about grace and forgiveness that I assume was meant for me. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have words, but because I'd already said everything that needed to be said. Not to them, but to myself. When I made the decision to stop handing over pieces of my peace in exchange for scraps of inclusion. What they still don't understand, and maybe never will, is that the cabin wasn't just about land or legacy or tradition. It was about being seen, about the effort that goes unnoticed until it disappears, about the years I spent patching walls, clearing snow, paying bills, and hosting holidays that no one remembered unless something went wrong. It was about watching my contributions get erased in real time, while Rachel's were immortalized with photos and praise and social media posts that told a version of the story, where I was always just there, silent, expected, convenient. By the time I handed it to Jack, it wasn't just a retreat in the woods, it was my last offering, my final act of goodwill. And when they treated my absence as a favor to them, as if I was doing them a kindness by staying away, I realized they had already let me go long before I let go of that cabin, the part that unsettles them the most, the thing that keeps them up at night and makes them question every smug assumption they've ever made, is that I didn't lash out. I didn't yell or demand anything. I simply made a decision they weren't prepared for, and I did it with the kind of dignity they always assumed I lacked, because I never needed the spotlight to feel right in my own skin. They're still waiting for a confrontation that will never come, for a fight that will give them a chance to feel wronged instead of guilty. But I've moved past the need to offer them closure, because closure, like peace, isn't something you get from other people. It's something you claim when you finally recognize your worth doesn't depend on their acknowledgement. Your joy doesn't require their validation, and your space, physical or emotional, is not a gift you owe anyone who refuses to treat it with respect. So no, I didn't send gifts this year. I didn't write a card or call or ask if they found somewhere else to spend Christmas morning. I didn't tell them I forgave them or invite them to explain themselves or leave the door cracked open just in case they changed. Because I know them, they won't change. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter, not because I'm cold, but because I'm done waiting for a version of them that doesn't exist. They can have their Christmas, with their edited memories and curated smiles and stories that pretend I was never the one holding it all together. They can bake their cookies and wrap their matching pajamas and post their photos and pretend it's all still whole. And maybe, just maybe, when they drive past that cabin again, quiet now, sturdy, off limits in a way they don't understand, they'll feel something they can't quite name, but I'll know what it is. It's the sound of a door closing, not slamming, not locked with fury, just closed, finally, peacefully, and for good.